Grief. It's something that, at some point in our lives, almost all of us will certainly experience. What is grief? Why is it such a powerful emotion? How do people manage grief? And why, out of all of the interesting topics to do a podcast episode on, would I start with something so heavy? All of these questions and more will be answered on this first episode of Your Mind On. Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of Your Mind On, a podcast where each week I pick a topic within the world of psychology, deep dive into the research of it, and present it to you along with some personal experiences, insights, and some thoughts as well. Some episodes, like this one, will be about emotion and life experience. Others will be about studies that have been done in the past that have had a large impact on our understanding of psychology and the human mind. While still others will be about psychological conditions such as psychopathy or maybe bipolar disorder. My name is John Shaw, your host for this independent podcast. I've had a lifelong fascination with psychology and a lifetime of experiences and education that have inspired me to create this. Hopefully, it'll be something that people will want to come back to each week as we expand our knowledge and mental well-being. If you want to know more about me, you'll be able to learn piece by piece each week as I share personal experiences and anecdotes, or in the near future, you will be able to visit the website for the podcast where I'll be posting the reference materials I use, sources, there'll be an About Me section, and probably a lot of other things that I just haven't thought of yet. I just haven't gotten the page created yet. Hopefully over the next few weeks I'll have that up and running. But enough about me. Let's get to why you're really here. It's time to get a bit heavy. This is a new podcast, and I've chosen the first episode to be about a topic that just really isn't fun. A topic that may not be as interesting or fascinating as so many other topics that I could have chosen as a stepping off point. So why did I choose this one? So when I initially began planning out this podcast, grief wasn't even on my list of possible topics to discuss in the first 5 to 10 episodes. Honestly, it hadn't even occurred to me to cover this topic at all. However, life tends to dictate our decisions far too often. In March of 2024, my 21-year-old son told me that he had just been diagnosed with stage 3 testicular cancer. And like most parents would, I immediately drove the 12 hours from my house near Portland, Oregon, to his in Great Falls, Montana. I went with him to the initial surgery that was to remove the infected area to try to stop the cancer from spreading. Now, testicular cancer is one of the most, if not the most, treatable cancers. So while there was some concern, it is cancer after all, there was also a lot of confidence. After that, over the next year, he would start with the normal chemotherapy treatments, round after round, dose after dose. And when that wasn't working, he went to a cancer clinic in Indiana for more advanced treatment. After his treatment there, things were looking really good. It looked like he was going to make a full recovery, and life could go back to normal, or whatever the new normal would be at that point in time. My son really wanted to start a campaign to help raise awareness for testicular cancer. He was busy with artwork, trying to design shirts, stickers, and just trying to come up with ideas that he could use as a platform to raise awareness. While he was doing this, he went for more blood work, and they found that the markers they used to judge the cancer were skyrocketing once again. And cue more chemotherapy treatments, more hoping that this treatment would be the one that gets the job done, and more disappointments when those treatments didn't work. Then, on May 15th of this year, I got a text from my son's mom that he was in the emergency room. There was fluid in his lungs, pneumonia, and when they did scans of his lungs, it showed that the cancer had spread to his lungs, and not just in a small way. It was at this point that the oncologist said that my son could try to continue the latest chemotherapy that he had just started the week before, but that at that point in time it would likely just be doing more harm to his body than to the cancer. And with that, my son was given a time frame of as little as 1 week to as much as 1 year. My daughter and I immediately made the drive back to Great Falls to visit him in the hospital. It was only when I got there that I could really see how bad things were. He was struggling to breathe. His face was almost a grayish color. And you could just tell that he really was unwell. Over the next 3 days or so, his color improved as the antibiotics knocked out the pneumonia, and I watched as he recovered some of his strength as well as his smile and laughter. I made the trip back home with plans to return in 2 weeks and to begin splitting time between my home and his. I was going to be going there for 2 weeks and then coming home for 2 weeks. This plan, however, wouldn't work out. On Sunday, June 8th of this year, the cancer took my son. I cannot even begin to describe what it feels like to lose a child, and honestly, I wouldn't even want to if it were possible. I don't want anyone else to have to know what this kind of pain feels like. Only those that have lost children really know how it feels, and I think they would all agree with me that no one should have to know how it feels. The grieving process for me began long before my son's passing, and so my experience is different from people that have lost someone suddenly. In some ways, maybe it was easier as it was spread out over a longer period of time. But when you boil it down, grief is grief. So what is grief? I think that intuitively we all know what grief is, and the definition or explanation is exactly what you would think. A complex, deeply personal, and multifaceted response to loss. Grief isn't limited to the death of a loved one, though. Grief can also be experienced during significant life changes, such as job transitions, the end of a relationship, or even moving to a new city or country. Largely, grief is associated with death, and because of my personal experience, that's mainly the capacity I'll be referring to it in this episode. But know that it does extend to other major life events as well, and can be just as severe and hard to deal with. So how do we recognize grief? With the loss of a loved one, it's pretty straightforward. But for the other parts of our lives, it can be harder to realize that what we are feeling is grief. Grief is often an emotional roller coaster. It can include many varying emotional responses from sadness to confusion to guilt and even relief. Sadness is the emotional response I think most people associate with grief. And some people might be surprised by some of the other responses. So let's look briefly at those. Confusion is far more common in grief than you might think. This is often expressed with thoughts or questions of, what do I do now? How do I move on? How could this happen? When a major aspect of our life changes, whether that's the death of someone close to us or losing a job that we love, it can be a confusing experience. We often think of our lives as a story, and we know the main plot line of how we get from the beginning to the end. When we suffer a major loss, that changes the main plot, and it can be a very confusing situation. Nothing seems to make sense anymore. And then there's a feeling that often catches people off guard: guilt. I think that guilt is the one that is often overlooked and not as well understood in the grieving process. Personally, I didn't cause my son's cancer. I wasn't the reason that the chemotherapy didn't work. So why would I feel guilty? Well, the answer's pretty simple. It's because he's my son. He was young. just less than a month before his 23rd birthday. He had so much more to experience in life while I've been around for a while. I've been married twice. I've had kids. I've been in combat. I've loved and lost. I've grown. I've seen a lot of the world. I've done a lot of dumb things that could have taken me from this earth. And yet I'm still here. And he was just starting out. So in that sense, yes, I do feel some guilt. Guilt that I haven't lived the best life that I can, haven't made all of the best decisions, while he barely had the opportunity to make any decisions at all, good or bad. Guilt is also very common when grieving major traumatic events. For example, first responders were racked with guilt after the 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. How could one person survive when someone else didn't? Combat veterans also experience this. People that survive car accidents where someone else didn't survive also go through it. Guilt is an extremely common reaction to grief, and it's important to recognize it when you feel it. It's important to experience it, and more important to work through it with friends, family, or professional counselors, whether that's spiritual or psychological. And then we come to relief. Why would anyone ever feel relief during the grieving process? Relief may not be felt by everyone experiencing grief, of course, but for many it's a real experience. In my situation, I did realize during the first week after my son passed that I did feel relief. And as soon as I recognized that feeling, I was disgusted with myself. What a horrible, horrible thing to feel after losing a child. However, relief is an important feeling during grief. It's a part of acceptance. I feel relieved that my son doesn't have to suffer anymore. I feel relieved that he doesn't have to go through hell with all of the chemotherapy anymore. I feel relieved that we don't have to get our hopes up for the latest treatment only to have the hopes smashed when the treatment doesn't work. And I also feel relief that this whole horrible experience is over. And, as I mentioned, acknowledging and accepting this feeling of relief helped me into the final stage of grief, and that's acceptance. Now, what do I mean by the final stage of grief? Most people have probably heard of the stages of grief before and are largely familiar with it, and often use it as a sort of roadmap. But it isn't quite that simple. Developed as the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, the concept was developed as a way of helping terminally ill patients come to terms with their terminal diagnosis, and it was later extended into the experience of their own grief at the loss or impending loss of a loved one. So what exactly are the 5 stages? The first stage is denial. Sometimes this can be outright denial of the entire situation. Often, it's when we think that the doctors have made a mistake, or that the person notifying us of a loss have the wrong person. Maybe it's someone else and the information got confused. It can be the thought or feeling that this isn't really happening. Not to me. Denial is, in my opinion, one of the hardest stages to go through. I feel like a lot of people never really truly get through the denial stage. The second stage is anger. This is definitely one of the most unpleasant stages and is so completely natural. We want to blame someone. We want to blame something. Whether it's that the stupid doctors don't know what they're talking about, so we should find a better one, or finding someone to blame for whatever we are experiencing. Anger is an important stage to take note of. We can only get through this stage with a lot of self-reflection and talking things out. Or even accepting that while we want someone to blame, someone to be angry at, sometimes there just isn't anyone to be angry with. After the treatment in Indiana failed for my son, my first thought was that the doctor wasn't good enough at his job. We needed to find someone more knowledgeable, more experienced. This is, I'm sure, a common tune when it comes to terminal illness. However, as I found out, it's often wrong. The doctor that treated my son in Indiana was the same doctor that successfully treated Lance Armstrong's brain cancer. It's pretty hard to say that he doesn't know what he's doing when he has that on his resume. Eventually, I had to redirect my anger. I couldn't blame someone else. I could, however, be angry at the situation, and I think that's the important distinction that people need to make. It's okay to be angry at the situation. The third stage is bargaining. Bargaining is typically a spiritual experience during the grieving process. This is usually the take me instead stage, as I like to think of it. Praying to anyone that will listen, trying to strike a deal with whatever higher powers are out there. This stage is one that most often ends with someone who was very devout in their religion becoming disenfranchised because their prayers weren't answered. It can even lead back into the anger stage. And then we come to the fourth stage, and that's depression. This is, I believe, another stage where people often get stuck. Depression, which will certainly be a topic we cover at some point in the future, is the most difficult part of the process. We lose all interest in the things that have always brought us joy. Our eating choices get questionable, assuming we eat at all. Depression is the most dangerous stage of the grieving process. We acknowledge that regardless of what it is we are grieving, nothing will ever be the same again. And we begin to question whether or not we can even go on in the world where this has happened in our lives. Depression is very real, and it is something that is experienced by nearly everyone at some point. Depression is one of the main reasons why it's important to not completely isolate during grief, no matter how badly we may want to, because dark thoughts can take over our minds really quickly when we're alone. We need to be aware of this stage in people that we know that are grieving, and we also need to recognize it within ourselves when we are grieving. If you can't find a way out of the darkness of depression, it is absolutely vital that you seek out help immediately. And the final stage is acceptance. We have now experienced a wide range of emotions and have come to realize that the world will keep turning. Life will go on, however painfully that might be after the experience. It's at this stage where we begin to put our lives back together and begin figuring out how to move forward again. The 5 stages of grief are not set in stone, however. This is one of the reasons I think psychology and the human mind are so complex. When we get the flu, there are specific symptoms and treatments. There are symptoms that generally everyone with the flu experiences. But with grief, it's different. Some people may never bargain or feel angry. Some might not even experience depression. Also, the stages are not always experienced in that specific order. For some, they might start with denial, and then bargaining, and then anger. Then possibly go back to denial before moving into depression and finally acceptance. Some people will reach the 5th stage of acceptance, and suddenly they're back in depression or anger. So while the 5 stages work well as a guide, they are in no way an exact blueprint of the grieving process. A lot of mental health professionals would prefer to refer to these as states rather than stages, because it takes away from the linear feeling of the stages model and more closely just identifies which of these experiences a person is currently in, and knowing that they will change states again, and it could be any of the other 4, because each person is different and experiences different things. That's what makes grief so difficult to manage, is that it is truly a deeply personal experience. Not everyone experiences grief the same way. Not everyone can move beyond grief using the same techniques. This is something that I realized naturally immediately after getting the news of my son's passing. The traditional mainstream notion that I've always seen when it comes to grief is to surround yourself with family and friends. Never be alone. Share your feelings with those around you. But I'm an introvert, and this approach generally doesn't work well for me. I needed time to be alone. I needed time to process what had happened in my own comfortable setting without any interruptions. My wife, understandably, was not comfortable with this at first. Grief can be an overpowering, overwhelming experience, and being alone for some people can be the worst possible thing. But for others, like me, it's exactly what's needed. As I said, not everyone experiences grief in the same way, and not everyone manages grief in the same way. One factor that can make grief different for everyone is whether the person experiencing grief is an introvert or extrovert. Introvert versus extrovert is another topic we'll certainly discuss in the future, but for now I'll just give it a very basic definition or distinction between the two. Contrary to what I was always told as a child and into my teen years, being an introvert is not the same as being shy. Extroverts are happiest and energized when they're around other people and have social interaction. They recharge their emotional energy through interacting with other people. Introverts, however, recharge through alone time and quiet. This can impact the way people experience grief and how they can manage the experience. For me, I needed time to be alone to properly experience my grief, to process it. I needed to be alone with my thoughts and memories. However, this can be disastrous for an extrovert. Since extroverts need social interaction to feel more normal, being alone during grief can compound the feelings and heighten the negative feelings, particularly in the depression state. This can really make things difficult when someone you know is grieving. If they are typically an extrovert and suddenly isolate themselves, it should be a cause for concern. They could be experiencing depression along with grief, and being alone can lead to the depression deepening to the point where they may consider harming themselves. However, again, not everyone processes grief the same way, so despite being an extrovert, they may just need some time alone to process. And it's the same with introverts. Pressuring an introvert to have social interaction, especially during the grieving process, could end up with them being agitated and depressed because they need that quiet solitude to reflect and process. But there's also the possibility that an introvert that is isolating during grief could also find their depression deepening and lead to thoughts of self-harm. So how do you make sure that someone is able to grieve while making sure they are still in a good state of mind? The ideal solution to this is self-regulation. During the first week after my son passed, I spent a lot of time alone so I could allow myself to truly feel and experience the grief. But I had to do a lot of self-regulating and monitoring. If my thoughts had started to turn dark, I planned to turn to my wife or call and talk to my parents. I also had reached out to my therapist, my counselor, so she knew what was going on and that I may need an emergency session at a moment's notice. I stayed in constant communication with people through text message to check in and make sure that everyone knew that I was doing all right. Some people aren't as well versed in self-regulation and monitoring of their own emotions. Emotions can be a big thing to handle, and it's easy to get lost in them. So it's important to keep tabs on the people we know are experiencing grief. Pay attention to major changes in personality and actions. The extrovert that suddenly isolates. The introvert that completely cuts off all communication. These are just two examples of changes in behavior that could be concerning. It doesn't mean you should immediately call for help, but it should be an indicator to continue checking in with them, maybe more than you have been even. The key here is knowing the difference between seeking solitude and isolation. As I was working through the first week of grief, I was very conscious of this within myself. I needed my solitude, but I also knew that completely isolating myself was not a good thing. I received a lot of text messages from friends and family, and honestly, to some degree, it irritated me. I didn't want to talk to people. I wanted to be left alone. I didn't want to go anywhere. But I also knew that this could lead me down a dark path, so I made sure that nearly every day I would make plans to get out of the house and spend time with my wife, to go out for dinner or just walk in a park together. While I didn't feel up to doing these things, I also knew that it was important to keep connection to people that are living so that my mind wasn't completely preoccupied with the thoughts of my son. Another thing to pay attention to within yourself as you grieve, as well as with others, is a sudden change in typical pattern of behavior. One example of this from the sources is a story of a woman that was very much an introvert. She got married, socializing with her husband was the only regular form of social interaction that she had. It became natural and comfortable. In a sense, she had become a sort of hybrid introvert where she depended on her time with her husband to fill that social need. But then her husband passed away. And rather than isolating and managing her grief in a way that would be typical or common for an introvert, she began socializing way more. She would spend a lot more time away from home and out with friends and family. This might look like, and it might be, a healthy response to grief, but it could also be a warning sign. In a situation like this, where someone you know is not an overly social person, and they suddenly begin being constantly social during the grieving process, it could be an indication that they are avoiding or hiding from grief. Rather than processing their grief, they are giving themselves a distraction from it, which could lead to the grief and depression hitting very hard and very suddenly out of nowhere. And it could even be harder to deal with. But, as I've said, this isn't always the case. Again, constant communication and checking in is necessary. It's vital. Make sure that they are not just hiding from the grief or trying to ignore it. Maybe invite them to have a coffee somewhere private just to see if they need to talk. Ease into the conversation to test the waters, to make sure that you aren't going to aggravate the situation while also giving them a safe space to open up about their grieving. It is so important to understand the baseline of our own behaviors and that of the people that we care about. And grief is one of the big reasons why. Seeing the change in our own behavior or in someone else during grief can help prevent depression from taking over, but it's also important to understand the way we or other people process information and experiences. It's important to socialize and be around people we care about during grief, but it's also important to recognize the need for some solitude and reflection. It can be a delicate wire to walk. So now that we've talked a lot about grief, what it is, and how to recognize our needs and the needs of others while grieving, but what about strategies for managing and processing grief? When we experience true grief, I believe, we never actually heal. We just get used to the feeling of that particular loss. We get used to the new job or the new home or the person that we care about being gone. It will always hurt to some degree, but it's not as severe of a feeling. But the real monumental task here is to get from the initial stages of grief where everything hurts, the tears flow constantly and seem to come out of nowhere, to the point where we can function again normally. So here are some strategies that experts advise. Practice mindfulness. What is mindfulness? Mindfulness is the practice of paying attention to the present moment without judgment, allowing for a state of clear and calm awareness. Some key steps in mindfulness when managing grief are acceptance. Accept that you're grieving. Accept that grief doesn't follow any particular roadmap and that emotions can come out of nowhere. Anything can trigger strong emotions while you're grieving, whether it's a memory, a particular song or a sound, certain smells, and so much more. Accept that you could be in public and having a great time with family or friends one moment and have tears streaming down your face the next. And know that it's perfectly natural and normal. The next one, express your feelings. There are many ways to express your grief in a healthy way. Some common ways are journaling, scrapbooking, or just telling stories. This episode is a great example of that. By researching, writing, and recording, I'm acknowledging the grief that I've been feeling and dealing with it in a helpful way. Reach out. For some people, isolation can be a natural reaction to grief, as we've said. It certainly is for me, but it's important to talk to someone. Talking to a psychologist or a spiritual counselor can be a tremendous help. Shout out to my own therapist, Dr. Boyd. Talking to family and friends to share stories and memories is also a very helpful way to cope. Now, some people like myself are introverts and spend a lot of time living in their own heads. Talking to people can be a bit overwhelming, so balance is the key. And a trick I've found for myself that helps is talking to my dog. Sure, she can't respond, but she's an excellent listener. Well, most of the time, she is a husky after all. Continue taking care of yourself and others. This is absolutely one of the hardest things to do, especially when the grief is new. For myself, I found myself lacking motivation to do the simple things that I needed to do. Laundry, dishes, cleaning the house, and even cooking were just too taxing. My daily diet began coming from a freezer section or from a drive-through window. Dishes would get done when there was no room left in the sink. However, I do feed my dog home-cooked food. And, of course, she relies on me for this. I couldn't give her a McDonald's cheeseburger while I ate mine, so I had to push through and continue to cook for her. Knowing that the sweet dog depends on me to do the things for her that she can't, helped me begin doing the things I needed to get done, to start living my life again. It can feel like a real mountain to climb, but eating well, practicing good hygiene, and exercise are essential to helping overcome grief. Celebrate your loved one's life. While this doesn't apply to everything that causes grief, it certainly is in the case of a death, and it's critically important. Of course, we all do this through funerals, wakes, and other rites and rituals of death practiced around the world. It's important to go beyond this, though. Before my son passed, I had told him that I would be getting a tattoo to match one of the first ones that he ever got. When he passed 1 week before Father's Day, I immediately scheduled an appointment with a tattoo artist. So I spent Father's Day this year, which really didn't feel like a day to celebrate, in my opinion, suffering a loss that's close to Father's Day. I spent Father's Day at the tattoo shop. I got the exact same tattoo that he had, in the exact same location, and even done by the same tattoo artist using the same original artwork she had drawn for his. I've also become much more outspoken about cancer, about doing self-exams, and having those difficult conversations with doctors. I'll throw a little plug in here. Make sure you know how to do your self-exams. And if you think you feel something, go ahead and talk to your doctor. It's better to be a little embarrassed talking about something uncomfortable than, going through chemo. Dealing with grief has been a major theme in my life this year, and you've probably gathered that by now. The day my son passed, a lot of family and friends reached out and didn't want me to spend time alone. But I knew that I did need to spend some time processing the loss initially at first, and that it's fine to do that if that's your nature. However, as time went on, I realized that I was sinking into dark thoughts, depression, isolation, and was no longer taking care of myself. As this realization came to me, I was able to have that conversation with my therapist and got on medication to help me manage the depression. There's no shame in that. This brings up the point that I am certain I will say many times in future episodes as well. Talk to your therapist and be honest. If you don't have one, a therapist, get one. Working with a therapist doesn't mean you're crazy. It doesn't mean you're weak. Think of it this way. If you have a major issue with your car or truck, you talk to a mechanic. It's the same with appliances, home repairs, and so many other things in life. We know that if something is wrong and needs fixed, we talk to an expert. Traditionally, though, when it comes to our mental health, it's been kind of a social taboo to seek help. This is a major issue in society, and I think it's improving, but there's still a long way to go. You don't need to be experiencing a negative psychological issue to seek out a mental health counselor. It's freeing to have someone non-judgmental to talk to about the good, the bad, someone who can help you identify where things might be going wrong and how to correct it. Another major step that I took to help overcome my grief was to let myself experience some joy again. So at the end of summer, late August, my wife and stepson and I made a long road trip down through California, the Redwoods, Alcatraz. We spent 3 days at Disneyland, and we had an absolutely phenomenal time. And that really helped me put one foot in front of the other and start moving forward in life again. And I'm truly and eternally grateful to my wife for helping me with that journey and making it such a successful trip. So as I begin wrapping this up now, I want to offer some of my own insights on grief. They say that time heals all wounds. But from what I've found, this just simply isn't true. When you suffer a major loss in life, time doesn't heal that wound. It'll stay with you forever. You just have to learn how to live with it. Initially, as I was writing this out, I said that it will always be a scar on your psyche. And even that's not accurate. Rather than a scar, it's more of a scab, because it can break open again at any time. And it will just always be that way. In order to change this wound to a scar or a scab, time alone can't do that. You have to work on moving forward, and that's the hardest part. Make yourself a good dinner. Go out with friends. Find a television series or a book series to get lost in. Talk to your friends and family. Talk to a therapist. Avoid things that will not help you move beyond the pain. I know it's very common during the grieving process for people to turn to things like alcohol. And that's just not going to help anything. So if you find yourself sinking into darkness, being consumed by dark thoughts or feelings that there's nothing left in life to enjoy, get help. Again, talk to family and friends. Definitely talk to a therapist. You can even reach out to me using the email address hello@yourmindonpodcast.com. I am not a licensed therapist. I cannot offer you counseling, but I will offer you an ear that will listen to what you have to say. I will be completely non-judgmental, and I'll try to hold any advice I have for if you actually ask for that advice. Life will get better, and the pain will become manageable, but you have to put in some work to make that happen. Find that source of light in life again and move toward it. I want to thank you all for listening, and hopefully enough people will listen that I can continue this moving forward. I plan to release a new episode, as I said before, each week, and no, they're not all going to be this heavy. Next week, we will explore one of the more fascinating psychological experiments that has been conducted, in my opinion, and that is classical conditioning and Pavlov's dogs. Again, thank you for listening, and remember, understanding your mind is the first step to changing your life. Until next time, be kind to yourself.